Good afternoon. I'm Andy Shiels. I'm Deputy Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. And thanks for joining us today for our first ever virtual fishery summit. Hopefully throughout the day, you've been watching either on YouTube or via Facebook Live. Our presentations are a number of different species and species groups. And we're at the part of the day where we want to sum up all those presentations and give the public an opportunity to have some questions answered that have been supplied to us throughout the day via Facebook. And so what we have with us today are a number of fisheries biologists and experts and a subset of those folks who did presentations earlier today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through questions and summarize those, provide them to the staff, take some turns, and see if the staff can provide good answers and hopefully further inform the folks that took the time to watch and pose questions to us. So to get started, I would like the staff to identify themselves and just tell you who they are and where they're from. And after that, we'll get right into the questions. We'll start with Brian.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Brian Inside. I'm a fishery biologist with the Commission. I work out of our Area 2 Fisheries Management Office. That's located in Tionessis. That would be the northwest side of the state.
And Chris.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Kuhn. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Fisheries, and my office is located at the Center Region office in Center County.
Dave.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Nyart. I'm the Chief of the Division of Fisheries Management. Like Chris, I'm based out of our Center Region office in Bellefonte, PA.
And Daryl?
Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daryl Pierce. I'm the Area Fisheries Manager for Area 5, which is the Upper Delaware Basin, including the Lehigh and Lackawaxen rivers. I'm based in Bushkill, which is in Pike County.
And Jeff.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeff Smith. I'm Susquehanna River biologist, and like Dave and Chris and Andy, I'm located in the Center Regional Office in Bellefonte in Center County.
All right, thanks guys. There are a number of questions asked regarding riverine bass fisheries. So Jeff's going to be handling a couple extra questions today. But the first one we want to start off with is a question about bass. And a question for Chris Kuhn would be, do bass feed up for winter, or because they're cold-blooded, is this unnecessary? In other words, do bass go into some extra feeding mode when they sense that winter is coming? Chris.
Thanks, Andy. So to address that, so not necessarily do they go into a feeding frenzy or increase their feeding right before winter. They're actively feeding during the warm period of the year, throughout the year to gain the reserves to better overwinter. So there's a few things that are going on with bass and other warm, cool water fish as they prepare for winter. They're considered to be poikilothermic, not cold-blooded, which that essentially means that their body temperature is generally controlled by their environment, but they can control it to some degree. So their metabolism is going to slow. So they will not be overly active as water temperatures cool. And what they do during that period is they seek out the deepest, slowest water so that they can maximize their energy expenditures or lessen their energy expenditures and reduce their metabolism as the temperature there may be the most stable also during the deep, slow water areas of the river. Also, food resources will be scarce as well. Crayfish, largely dormant. Other fish species lessen their activity because they are also considered to be ectothermic or cold-blooded, and so those species can't regulate their own body temperature. But interestingly, bass reproduction begins shortly after winter ends, for a warm water stream fish standpoint, anyway. So a large portion of the resources needed to fuel the development of reproductive tissues will start to be accumulated in the late summer, early fall period, since there will be very little time in the spring to develop those tissues before spawning commences. The increased feeding activity that occurs during the fall is putting them in a good position to overwinter and be more fit when spring spawning season rolls around. what we know about seasonal smallmouth bass movements tells us that as soon as winter is over, the first movement that occurs is to the spawning grounds.
Good. Thanks, Chris. So Jeff, I think we'll give you the next question, and I just want to summarize this question into a general statement. It's a question regarding smallmouth bass diet, river smallmouth bass diet. So it had to do with crayfish and finfish, and an idea or perhaps some insight into how a smallmouth bass diet might shift during the year and how they might shift back and forth between crayfish and finfish like minnows, darters, small suckers, things of that nature. Could you provide some insight on smallmouth bass riverine diet, perhaps through the season?
Yeah, I mean, smallmouth bass generally are opportunists. They're going to take advantage of whatever they can get, whenever they can get, and expend as little energy as possible doing so. So, we talk a lot about the river diets, and, these habitats are largely benthic. I mean, the stream bottom covers most of the area, so there's really not a lot of other type of species. So they'll be slanted slightly towards benthic species, but that's not necessarily a focus for them. Most of the prey items there because that's most of the habitat, and most of the species that are present. When you look at diets for lakes and some other places, you'll see that diet shift slightly and be a little bit more pelagic. They still have those, the crayfish species and other species like that as a large portion of their diet. But you'll see some more pelagic fish moved in because there's more of that habitat. That being said, we know that there are seasonal cues that bass do that kind of show that they're not oriented entirely to the bottom. Things like they eat mayflies. So for times of the year, they're eating emerging maytides, so they're looking up and feeding that way as well. And they've known to cue on behavior patterns of other fish, like seasonal movements of American shad in the fall when they emigrate to go back to the river. So they'll take off, and they know to start cueing on those. And gizzard shad have some seasonal movements as well. And interestingly, this year we'll have a seasonal, just lost the word, emergence of one of the large insects. So they'll be keying on those as well to pick those up. So while they kind of shift and move around in their diet, they are strongly based on the benthic species like crayfish, but they'll take whatever they can get whenever they can get it.
So in other words, obviously fish are opportunists.
Mhm.
They're probably favorite foods that they prefer, but if the right food goes by, they're probably going to take advantage of that opportunity. Okay. The next question, we'll do this one also for Jeff, and this one is about largemouth bass fires in the Susquehanna River. And it's been in the news for a number of years. I know in your presentation you provided some information about it. The question is what are the improvements to the fishery, or what is the state of the fishery now compared to the last few years in relation to largemouth bass fires, specifically in that middle Susquehanna River portion, say between Sunbury and Holtwood? Can you provide any additional insight to that, Jeff?
Yeah, we're in a lot better position now than we were in the mid to late 2000s. Outbreaks were large, and we weren't seeing a lot of recruitment of juvenile bass. But somewhere around 2010, you started to see largemouth bass virus or the disease rate, the mortality associated with it start to wane. And then we had really three strong year classes after that in 2012, 2015, and 2016 that really bolstered the numbers of bass after that. And that's pretty typical of the bass population. When you have these strong year classes, they rebound pretty quickly. So following that period from 2016, 17, 18, we started to have a really high abundance of bass in the river. We did have a little blip in 2019 where we must have had a mortality event of adults that we're not really sure what happened, but we did appear to lose some fish. But we've had two large year classes, 2019 and it looks like another one in 2020, that should recruit really well and kind of fill in that space that was lost by those larger fish. But the large year class in 2015 should all be reaching about 16, 17 inches now. So there'll be a number of large fish coming through the population real soon. In terms of largemouth bass fires, we did see a little occurrence in 2020. It was kind of our first time seeing it in a long time, but we really had an exceptionally warm year, which is pretty good cue for largemouth bass virus. It's a temperature-mediated disease, so when it's really warm like that, is typically when you see it pop up. So we did have a little event of that in 2020 does not look like it was nearly as severe as some of those ones in the mid to late 2000s, though. So we don't think it substantially affected the year class. Our surveys in the fall of 2021 will give us a better feel for what the 2020 year class looked like and how well it survived.
Jeff, I just want to add something to that. I want to do a quick follow-up. So we know, but maybe the viewers may not know or understand what really impacts smallmouth bass spawning in the spring. What is the environmental condition that really makes it go or no go for successful smallmouth spawning in the spring in a riverine environment?
Yeah, and this is true for all our rivers and streams, and most of the streams all over the country where smallmouth bass reside is high flow events in the spring are really the big determining factor for smallmouth bass populations. And prior to disease in 2005, like that was our key factor. So when we have high flow events in late spring, once those fish have hatched and come off the nests, those are the factors that really determine year class strength. So if we have a high flow event in June, when those fish are newly hatched and swimming around and just don't have the strength to fight that heavy high current, we have high mortality at that point in time, and we have usually poor year classes. When we have really low flows and warm temperatures, those are usually prime year classes for smallmouth bass. The reproduction conditions are perfect. So is growth. That really warm temperature in the summer helps them grow really well, and they'll be very fit going into winter and overwinter well and survive. So high flow events in spring usually relate to poor year classes. Low flows in late spring and early summer and through the summer usually end up with very high year classes and good years for spawning and reproduction and substantially recruitment.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's important for our river anglers to keep in mind. They can almost predict what year classes will look like on their own based on their field observations.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to change it up a little bit and talk about panfish for a moment. One of the questions was, someone wanted to know, a viewer wanted to know, where do the growth tables come from? And mentioned that they catch some really large yellow perch, as large as, beyond 14 inches, and that the tables indicated such a perch might be as old as 14 years old. Brian, can you give us some insight on, I know several presentations talked about aging of fish, but can you give us some insight on how we use the data collected by all of our biologists around the state to get to averages, and so that we can make statements about what an average or typical fish of a certain age and a certain species, how old they might be, and how long they might be? Can you give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure. Thanks, Andy. So great question. You'll notice, again, as Andy mentioned, several of our presentations had growth curves in them. And basically that gives biologists an opportunity to take a look. The data that is generated out of these growth curves are from our surveys that we've done across Pennsylvania. So we do this for several species, not just yellow perch, but for walleye, muskie, bass. That gives us an idea of how well these fish are growing, as well as what size they are. We often use those for, say, legal size fish. How long is it going to take for fish to reach a legal size? And, it can be derived for individual waters, but most of the presentations that were provided today were basically a statewide average. So this is based on all the sampling collecting that we've done across the state. And we plot that on a growth curve to give us some insight on that, give us an idea of maybe how long our fish are living, what's the oldest fish that we see in certain populations and specific species. And keep in mind, with these growth curves, this is very a common way that published in literature. With these growth curves of how they're designed and what information provides to us as biologists. And basically, overall, it's to help better manage our fishery on a statewide, and we can look at individual populations and individual waters. Maybe that might provide us some information on there's some issues with maybe forage, some other things that why are they not growing so well? Why is it taking so long to reach maybe a statewide average for a length? What is the early life history? What is the older year history of these fish? So.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to throw one over to Chris as a follow-up to that. So in a number of these presentations, when we show the age data, there's a red line on the graph, and it shows what the legal size would be of a particular species. So why is that important, Chris, to the angler in trying to understand that, say, a muskie reaches legal length at 4 years of age, and maybe something else reaches a legal length of 6 years of age? how does reaching a legal length at a certain age, how do we use that information to make how we set regulations?
It certainly gives you an appreciation for how long it takes certain longer-lived species to reach that age. And in looking at the age, so in order to get to the legal harvestable size, the minimum length, the fish needs to recruit to that that segment of the fishery essentially and grow to that size. So we analyze all the data, look at the age information that comes in, and look at that, and that helps us to determine what is an appropriate age that we set for this. Also, we look at, also in terms of age, it's not only just the length. The length is an indication of how old the fish is, but it also indicates at what, we know when certain particular species become reproductively successful. And so we want them to get to that point before they are subject to harvest.
Excellent. The next question. This one is about, we did a presentation today, which we called it Overlooked or Missed Fisheries. We decided, everybody kind of knows what our common sport fish are, but we decided it was important to include some information about things like gar and bowfin and fall fish. And so we had a question. It was almost a comment as much as a question. And it was about, Fish and Boat Commission perhaps looking more deeply into regulating those overlooked fisheries and maybe promoting those overlooked fisheries. I'm going to ask Chris, as a beer director, do you have any thoughts or opinions about overlooked fisheries and how we might manage them differently in the future?
Yeah, certainly. So, one of the reasons why we included that is essentially what the commenter was getting at is that, these fisheries could be promoted. So we're starting that process here today and recognizing that they do support good fishing opportunities. And essentially the title of Doug Fisher's presentation, Overlooked Fisheries, speaks volumes. As its focus is to highlight fisheries that are commonly overlooked and underappreciated by anglers. So, as we saw here today in the presentation, there are fish populations in Pennsylvania that provide excellent angling opportunities aside from trout, bass, and other commonly recognized sport fish. As the commenter also indicated, and you mentioned, Andy, restrictive regulations are likely not needed to protect these fisheries because they are underutilized and not overexploited. I would say, but getting the word out today and in the future about their potential as fishable populations, anglers that utilize these fisheries will ultimately develop an appreciation for them and recognize their importance. We sometimes center our focus on individual species that we like to fish for, but may forget about these species that exist as part of the aquatic community. And the health of the aquatic community as a whole will determine the health of the individual fish species.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to throw one to you, Daryl. So Daryl did the presentation on migratory fishes, which are very unique in Pennsylvania. A lot of folks in Pennsylvania don't even realize, maybe some do, but a lot don't realize that we manage fish that run to the ocean and back again. And Daryl, you talked a bit about American eels, and we know that the most American eels in Pennsylvania occur in the Delaware system. We have them in the Susquehanna. We're working on restoring them there. But there was a question specifically about the Ohio River drainage, which is interesting because, American eels end up entering the Ohio River drainage through the Gulf of Mexico. Is there any information or insights you can share regarding eels in the Ohio River system?
Well, that's really crazy, isn't it? It's kind of like using the back door from the Atlantic Ocean to get fish into Ohio drainage. I never really associated the Atlantic Ocean and the Ohio Basin together, but worldwide, American eels are known to be in decline. And presently, right now, the coastal states on the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, are initiating a stock assessment for American eel. And so what happens is they come out of the tributaries where they've been living as adults in the Delaware or the Susquehanna or other major rivers and tributaries along the coast, and they go out and somewhere into the Atlantic Ocean, the Sargasso Sea, and spawn. And then the young then come out of the Sargasso Sea through drift And eventually some of them actually make it into the Gulf of Mexico and up the Ohio River and up the Mississippi to the Ohio River and into our state on the other side. From that stock assessment, hopefully we'll have a better understanding of what the American eel population is along the Atlantic coast, as well as how they recruit and potential influences on that. Because that's going to dictate what we're going to end up seeing in the Ohio Basin as well. One of the critical limitations, though, to migratory fishes, particularly in Pennsylvania or along the coast or even in the Ohio Basin, is barriers. And certainly through the Mississippi, you got a lot of lock and dams that those fish have to get through. Or even in the Delaware or in the Susquehanna has a hydroelectric power plants. They have fish passage, but it's very tough to get an American eel or a migratory fish up through the fish lifts and into the Susquehanna, or it's tough just to get them through a culvert, for instance, in the Delaware. So American eel, they can navigate some of that stuff, but when you get into large fish passage impediments, power dams, locks, it gets tough to get them through.
So I want to add just one additional thing for the questioner and others to think about regarding eels. So, as Daryl described, eels come back from the ocean as elvers, but they can spend anywhere from 7 to 20 years or more in fresh water. So imagine how far an eel could go over the course of 20 years and how far in a watershed it could get. And that's how you can imagine that something could go the whole way up the Mississippi River and end up in Western Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh.
Isn't that crazy thinking like that?
Yeah, it's a little bit at a time. And, in the restoration effort that's underway in the Susquehanna, when you put eels into new habitat where it's unoccupied by other eels, you find out that they grow really, really fast. Mm-hmm. They mature very quickly. And some of them now are maturing at age 5 and somewhere between age of 5 and 7, turning around and heading back to the ocean. And that's a phenomenon that's common when an animal is in an open habitat where it's not a lot of competition of others of its same species. So thanks for that, Daryl. We're going to take some of the questions that are popping up right now on Facebook. And the next one is about, can flathead or blue catfish be stocked in Cowanesque Lake so anglers can have another option for trophy catfish? And who should I give this one to? I could be nasty and give it to Dave, but I've got one for Dave. So I'm going to go ahead and give it to Jeff Smith, because Jeff has been working on invasive catfish research here in Pennsylvania now with Sea Grant for a couple of years. And I think Jeff is probably our expert, certainly in that drainage on these catfish. So Jeff, could you take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think with working with blue and flathead catfish, especially when you're talking about places that aren't their native range, you need to be careful what you wish for. Introducing them in the Cowanesque Lake, for instance, it's outside their native range. So species like that, when we put them outside their native range, they have no competition. Andy just mentioned eels, although native, that niche is unexposed. So when we put something like that in, they usually take off and do some level of detriment when you put them in the systems. Sure, they may be fun to fish for, and they are a trophy fish, and we don't have a whole lot around this area, especially in the Eastern Slope, that gets like that. So I could see the interest in them, but they do have a negative effect. And we're learning more and more about the blue catfish and flathead catfish's effects. We have more flathead catfish now that we're dealing with in Susquehanna, but to the south of us, and some of my partners in other states are dealing with blues and the negative effects of those. So putting them in a place where they don't originally inhabit isn't necessarily a great idea, and it may come with some pretty severe costs ecologically.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question, we'll give this to Brian Ensign. Is the Ohio River becoming progressively cleaner, and has that increased fishing in Pittsburgh's rivers?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, absolutely. And also share with you too that we do have a Three Rivers management plan that discusses a lot of kind of the history of the Ohio River, Three River system, Allegheny, Monongahela, as well as the Allegheny River. So You know, that's a great plan to kind of get some history on that plan. But yes, we have noticed over the years, just, you know, historically in Pennsylvania, we've had a lot of effects by man, you know, and especially in the Three Rivers area, of the impacts of pollution and urbanization and industrial, you know, and all of those. Unfortunately, when you have, you know, big industry like that, you know, oftentimes historically, you have those, you know, kind of getting into the water system down there. So, and historically back then, we didn't have really just tighter regulations with, you know, the you know, Cold Water Act, the you know, Water Act, and so now we do have that. We have accountability with that, and because of that, it's really been a cleaning up of our systems, of our water systems, and the protection of them, and obviously the fish species that reside in those. So yes, we have seen, you know, over the hundreds of years, and in the last century, I would say, of really increase in fisheries. I don't know if we had much of a, you know, as far as catfish populations, but you know, regarding sauger and walleye and muskie, we've really seen an increase in those populations that are interest of anglers within those systems, because they have those, you know, those systems have been much cleaner and they're being cleaned up continually. You know, big issue in Pennsylvania also is the acid mine drainage systems and things like that leach into there. That's still kind of some issues in Armstrong County there, you know, through the Three Rivers area from some of the streams. But as far as the general of the river itself, we've really seen a surge in those particular species that are interested by our anglers.
Thanks, Brian. I'm gonna give you another one here because it's about muskies.
Okay.
And this is a bit of a there's some opinion as well as a question here, I think, but you'll understand it. Somebody asked a question: how many smallmouth bass does an average size muskie eat in a year?
Well,
thanks for the question, Travis.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. Well, I mean, if you look at the diet of a muskie, what do these muskies like to? What are their staple diets? And primarily, it's going to be soft-rayed fishes. So, what do I mean by soft-rayed fishes? Well, we're talking about common. We're talking about gizzard shad. We're talking about suckers. You know, that's primarily the staple of their diet. Will they eat other things? Absolutely. You know, a muskie is a sight feeder. It's an opportunistic feeder. It'll feed on most things, but primarily the diet is fish, and primarily it's a soft-rayed fish. So that's kind of what we see. You know, there's been some concern about, you know, with our muskie fisheries. Now we're stocking yearlings. You know, what effect this might have on other populations within these lakes. That's something that we'll continue to study. We have a management plan in place for that, and continue to evaluate those stockings. But you know, consider that muskies are a low dense apex predator. There's not a ton of population in them when you compare that to like a walleye or a panfish or a bass. That, you know, those guys can really, you know, that's 8 times the amount of, you know, progeny that they provide, and spawning, and the, you know, number of fish in these water bodies. And muskies is nowhere near that dense of a population. So the thoughts of them affecting, you know, on other populations where we have good bass fisheries and good walleye fisheries, you know, that we'll continue to study that. But based on the peer-reviewed literature shows that they really can coexist in there, and they kind of have their own diet of what they what they choose to eat, and it's not necessarily all game fish.
Thanks, Brian. I mean, I think this goes back to what Jeff was talking about earlier regarding smallmouth bass. And as we, you know, none of us would say that a muskie would never eat a smallmouth, because as we discussed, if a smallmouth swam by the snout of a muskie, is within striking distance, and it was the right size, he might jump out and grab it, right? But there are preferred foods. And as you said, soft-rayed fishes are preferred by muskies, and that's things like suckers and even small carp and fall fish, chubs, things they can get down easily that don't present a threat to them with, you know, spines and fins sticking up. So thanks for the question. The next question I have here is for Dave Nyhart, and that is, how do you tell a wild trout from a stock trout?
That's a good question, and it's a question we often hear. And I assure you, whenever our staff are out there, we've handled thousands and thousands and thousands of wild fish over the course of our career. And certainly there's a couple key things that we look to identify. First off, excessive fin wear. As many folks that have fished for both wild trout and stock trout over the course of their lifetime, it becomes pretty apparent pretty quick that when you're dealing with the hatchery fish, just given the environment in which they're raised, typically in concrete raceways, they tend to exhibit extensive fin wear. So that's one of the key things that we look at right off the bat. Also, we look at coloration. So given that not necessarily in a hatchery setting, fish typically don't exhibit some of the more natural, beautiful colors that wild trout have. So those are really the two key things that we tend to look at. But also, while we're out sampling, you tend to look at things if you're coming across, the same size fish over and over again, your typical 7, 8, 9, 10, 11-inch wild trout, and you're not seeing anything of different age sizes. It's a pretty good indicator that you're typically dealing with fish from a hatchery and not from the wild.
All right, thanks, Dave. Chris, I'm going to give this one to you. This question says, as fishing pressure continues to grow, why have the daily creel limits not changed to keep up with the catch rate? For example, why are 50 panfish still allowed on lakes like Sweet Arrow? These lakes are way too small to have 50 fish limits. What can you tell us about quantities and creel limits? And we'll just use panfish as the example because we've got some good examples of that. How can you enlighten us on that, Chris?
Yeah, I'll try, Andy. So one of the things that I'll mention first off is that fisheries management is certainly an adaptive process that we refine based on data that we collect on an annual basis on the various fisheries, and not all fisheries are built the same. Oftentimes we have folks that are interested in catch and release regulations for a particular species that, where we don't see that harvest is actually a limiting factor. With panfish, we have segments of our angler populations that are interested in harvesting panfish. As the commenter mentioned, 50 fish is a somewhat liberal krill limit there. However, we do have some waters that we manage with more restrictive panfish regulations, and that's in our panfish enhancement program or with miscellaneous special regulations as it pertains to Sayers Dam. And so those fisheries have been identified based on their characteristics and qualities of those fisheries. And when I say fisheries, that's not only the fish population, that is the anglers that use them. So some areas and some waters are more apt to harvest, and we try to manage those accordingly based on the data that we have.
So I want to just a quick follow-up on that, Chris. So we've talked more than once about age data, and you've talked about special regulations for panfish. How does understanding the growth rate of, say, a population of crappies in a lake, how does that figure into whether or not you would apply special regulations?
So again, you'd look at the growth rates of the fish as part of the whole picture of the fishery. And so when you have populations that have a lot of older individuals in there that are slow growing, restrictive regulations may cause problems in some circumstances. So we look at the whole aspect of the population in managing our panfish fisheries.
Okay. I have one for Daryl. So Daryl is the area fisheries manager in northeastern Pennsylvania, which includes Lake Wallenpaupack. Daryl, there's a number of questions here, but I would suffice it to say could you give a description of the striped bass fishery in Lake Wallenpaupack, where it has been, where it is, and where do you think it's headed, both in the quality of the fishery and stocking numbers from Fish and Boat?
Right. So just to remind folks, Brian Chakotis gave a presentation earlier today about the inland stripers. Wallenpaupack falls in that program, where the striped bass in Wallenpaupack are a stock fishery, and we get those fish from out-of-state agencies or private entities on an annual basis as best we can. The last time we were on the lake specifically for striped bass, I believe was more than 5 years ago. We're due to come back through again here in the future. When we were there, striped bass were doing fine. We have a presence of both pures and hybrids in the lake. And I've been getting a few reports now from various anglers that they're getting concerned they haven't been catching them as often as they thought. Their catch rates are starting to decline a little. So what I need to do is get myself back out on the lake and redo the survey we did a few years ago, and we can do a comparison analysis between the 2 years and then make a conclusion of where they're at. In terms of stocking, Wampum Pack's on the list. It's in rotation. It's equality across the Commonwealth. It's not just all about Wampum Pack, but we certainly like to get fish in there.
Okay, I have one for Dave Nyhart, and some of the older members of our team will know the nature of this question, I think. So the question is, golden rainbows are commonly referred to as palominos. This individual says, I'm old enough to remember when palominos were stocked. What happened to the palominos? You want to take a shot at that, Dave?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. But you're right, some of the older members, may be able to provide a better answer. But yes, the palomino was originally developed, I believe, in West Virginia, and Pennsylvania did stock it at one point. But given the success we've had with golden rainbow trouts, it kind of led us to steer away from stocking palominos. And we've been able to really develop a nice product, as you can see, with what we currently stock with our goldens, both in coloration as well. And I believe they're a far superior product to raise in a hatchery than what we have experienced with palominos.
Can Chris or Dave, can somebody describe the difference between golden rainbows and palominos, though? What is the difference?
Well, a golden rainbow trout is basically a color mutation of the rainbow trout, whereas the palomino would have been a cross with a rainbow trout. So golden rainbows are basically a rainbow trout, but just a color variant of the rainbow trout.
Okay. I'm trying to read this one. Yeah, I can't understand that question. Let me go back and check. Oh, I got a question about gar, which I will attempt to answer this one. So in my former years at Fish and Boat Commission, I worked in the non-game and endangered species unit and with endangered and threatened species and candidate species, of which long-nosed gar at one point had been. And so there was a question, really, it's a kind of a general question about gar in Conneaut Lake, gar in Conneaut Creek, and just going to take an opportunity to maybe just touch on gar for just a minute. So as we saw in the presentation by Doug Fisher, long-nosed and spotted gar are found in Lake Erie. Long-nosed gar are also found in other places in Pennsylvania, inland, the Three Rivers area, Conneaut Creek, which flows into Lake Erie, but most of it's in Pennsylvania, then a part of it enters into Ohio before it goes into Lake Erie. And so the question about long-nosed gar is, they're not really targeted in the north as a sport fishery. If you're in Presque Isle in the spring, if you're up there fishing for smallmouth, say in the month of May, or you're there later on in the summer, you can see gar cruising around just under the surface. And if it's in May, they're also in spawning mode. And you'll see groups of them acting like fish that are attempting to spawn, chasing each other, small schools. You can catch them from time to time, primarily when they're interested in spawning. They're more difficult to catch. But, just think about weedy habitats in places like Presque Isle, the upper end of the bay, the lagoons. They can be found around riprap along the Lake Erie shoreline, close to Presque Isle Bay, backwater areas of the Ohio River and tributaries. And so there was a question about, well, Conneaut Creek, are they still common there? Is it a lake run population? I don't know the direct answer if there is lake movement of gar in and out of Lake Erie. It's certainly not like you would imagine steelhead to be, but there's enough good, slow water, low gradient habitat in Conneaut Creek to hold long-nosed gar year round. So I suspect there's not a major movement of long-nosed gar in and out of Lake Erie into Conneaut Creek. unless it's only in the lowermost reaches of the stream, but that the upper portions of the stream in Pennsylvania would provide good habitat for gar. And much like the bowfin discussion, think weedy, low oxygen, slow water, still water. Those are the areas within the natural range where you're most likely to find them. Let me check and see if we've gotten some new questions here.
Hey, Andy, real quick on that too.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead,
there was some questions about the gar in Conneaut Lake, and yes, there is still a population in Conneaut Lake as well. That's in Crawford County, and therefore we just did a recent survey there. I believe it was 2019. We did our last survey, and they've always shown up in fair numbers in the lake. I think there was some questions about possibly, has there been a decline in the population? And I wouldn't say our historical sampling in there. We've always documented several fish. I wouldn't say there was a huge population, so we really haven't seen a decline. I think they just have maintained their population in there. We primarily use trap nets early in the spring, and I think they're a little bit later in this, in the spring when they spawn. Some of our lakes do change in habitat. Conneaut Lake is one that's really got a lot of residents and camps and whatnot, or I should say houses, and is built up. So sometimes we'll see some changeover in our lakes, and some species thrive with that, and some decline in that a little bit. But as far as the gar population and our perspective of that particular water, the populations have remained stable.
So just a time check, we're at about 4:13. We're actually going to carry this for a few more minutes than we originally planned. We have a couple more questions. I have one for Chris. And the question was that somebody said there were a couple of 40 to 50-inch muskies caught in the Susquehanna River this week near York Haven. And the question is, how likely is it that those muskies could be stocked by the Fish and Boat Commission or could be wild? So to answer that question, Chris, and in general, if someone encounters a muskie in the wild when they're fishing, especially in a river system, how would you or a biologist or an angler have an opinion as to whether or not those fish would be result from our stocking or natural reproduction? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so from the biologist perspective, for sure, we've undertaken a large pit tagging effort that some of the presenters had talked about in various aspects. So when we're out there and we encounter a muskie during one of our electrofishing surveys, trap net surveys, we'll insert a pit tag, and when we have readers that will check to see if that fish was one of the tags, one of the fish that were tagged in previous surveys when we're out on the water. Anglers obviously don't carry pit tag readers with them, so that's going to be difficult for them. But for the most part, we do stock muskies in the Susquehanna River. So it's most likely that it is a result of the stocking. We do suspect that there's some natural reproduction. In North Branch, that was determined by former area manager Rob Lanook in his surveys on the North Branch that it was sustained through natural reproduction based on the results that he found in that particular reach of the Susquehanna. So it varies, but for the most part, when you're and I should say too that one of the things as part of our muskie plan update is that we're continuing to look more into our river systems and trying to determine whether there's natural reproduction there and assess our populations. So, but for the example that you provided, Andy, in that portion of the Susquehanna, I would say it's most likely they're the result of a stocking.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to get to invasive species here in a minute. A question came in and it was one of our presentations. But before that, I want to ask Brian Ensign a question. Brian, can you describe or at least tell our viewers why muskies are named the fish of 10,000 casts?
Yeah, so I covered very briefly of that in our tactics and tips and opportunities to go catch muskies. So yeah, I mean that is the cliche, right? It's a fish of 10,000 casts. Why is that? Well, again, with our population numbers, are kind of a low density type of apex predator. And So when we're out fishing for these guys, you know, again, when we compare it to like panfish or bass or things like that, they're more abundant in a lot of our water. So the chances of catching those fish obviously are greatly increased compared to, say, to a muskie. But you know, with muskie, they can be very picky, and they can be you know, very at times challenging to catch. And you know, presentation is everything. You know, where you're fishing at, what habitat you're trying to target. You know, you know, there are some challenges that way. We hope that in Pennsylvania with our stocking program that we're going to reduce that, how long it takes to catch one of those fish. You know, especially with the new stocking procedures that we have now and the changes that we've made. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the lure of the muskie fishing, right? Muskie and tiger muskie fishing is, yeah, it may take some time to catch that fish. You definitely have to put your time in. You know, talk to other people as well as read articles, get out obviously and do it more, pick good areas. You know, we have our best fishing waters page that definitely helps our anglers provide opportunities to those waters where you're going to increase your chances of catching those fish based on catch data and what we've been able to provide. But, you know, it's a sport you definitely, but think about it. How many other fish in Pennsylvania do you get the opportunity to try to catch like a 50-inch fish? You know, that's just incredible. And yeah, you're going to have to work at it a little bit, but I think the reward is such the payoff. It's just unique, you know?
So Brian, are you ready to commit that we're going to make it the fish of 9,900?
There are no guarantees from this guy, Andy, but we're hoping that it's going to be less than 10,000. I'll leave it at that.
Somewhere, but yeah, somewhere less than 10,000. Thank
Yes.
you for that. So Chris, I'm going to ask you to answer this question. And in answering the question, can you just give a brief overview about our new invasive species coordinator who we heard from, where we're headed with invasive species management, and just kind of give us a quick overview on how things have changed for us as an agency, even in the last few months, regarding our attention to aquatic invasive species.
Yeah, sure, Andy. So as Andy mentioned, we and folks have seen today, Sean Hartzell is our new Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator. That's a new position that was created by the agency recently and filled by Sean to devote solely towards invasive species and their management and trying to mitigate those impacts that they would have on our valuable sport fish populations. So just in creating that position and hiring on Sean, we're demonstrating a dedication basically to focus on invasive species a little more than we have in the past. And so we heard from a lot of different examples in Sean's presentation today. Jeff Smith touched on how you might view particular catfish species differently in different drainages when he was addressing the stocking question. And so it's something that we take very seriously as an agency, and we see there's a lot of different threats that are out there, and they have the potential to negatively impact our fisheries.
Excellent. We're going to take, I'm looking at the time, no more than 3 more questions, and then we'll wrap this up. I have a question for Daryl. So Daryl, can you describe how American eels were captured in the Delaware River and where someone could see remnants of those activities in this day and age?
Oh, absolutely. And so you're referencing the old commercial fishery. There is a limited entry fishery that's still continuing today that's permitted by the state of New York. You can see a working eel weir is what they're called. And they're up in the upper Delaware. I'm trying to think of a specific location. It's lost to me right now, but when you're going down the river, if you're kayaking, and you're going to see a low or a large V in the water. First, it looks like a riff when you're coming up to it on your kayak. And of course, I'm a little bit heavier than most folks, so I immediately start thinking I got to get out of the kayak and portage this thing around. But it's a large V. It's a low rock wall that people stack up the river rocks on the bottom. It goes almost bank to bank, but not quite. And then it funnels down into this wood structure in the middle of the river. And it's a series of slats. So let me see. There you go. So the fish come over top of this one, and then the water goes through the slats, and then they drop back into a catch basin here, and then they get funneled off to the side and sit there until the commercial fisherman comes to clean out the pot. And the concept is it's a silver eel fishery. So these are targeting the eels that are migrating out of the system to the Atlantic Ocean for spawning. And so the eel weirs are operated solely in the fall. During the summer or spring or winter months, the wood structures are taken away and it's just a remnant rock wall. It's generally how they operate. So when you kayak in the upper Delaware, if you see something that looks like a rock wall, you probably came across an eel weir that may or may not still be operational for the state of New York fishers.
Thanks, Daryl. There's been some really interesting reports on this recently, that there's a high school teacher in the Sunbury area who has had his school students working on mapping ancient eel weirs on the Susquehanna River on the main stem that were built by Native Americans and in some cases continued by early settlers. There are still some on the Juniata River, and people that run those rivers in jet boats know that you can run the point of the V to get through and up the river in low water. And, you know, we as biologists do that when we're out sampling. And so even the remnants of historic, prehistoric almost eel collection can still be seen in Pennsylvania and the Delaware, on the Susquehanna and the Juniata River. It's pretty interesting. And then the West Branch of the Susquehanna as well. So we're about to wrap this up. I'm just checking to make sure. Yep, we're going to wrap this up. And I had a question for Dave Nyhart. And Dave, if you had one fishing tip to offer anglers as to how to find good wild trout fishing close to their home, what would it be?
I can definitely give you tips on how to find wild trout. Catching them may be best answered by somebody else for sure. But as mentioned during my presentation and the presentations of many others, our website has a lot of information out there. And one of the key things, resources available on our website is the county guide. And what is neat about that is if you can go and look at the state and click on a county, and you can add layers, whether it be Class A layers, wild trout layers, wilderness trout streams, whatever it may be, whatever you're interested in finding. And once you identify one of those locations, you can click on it. It'll tell you the name. And one of the really neat things is it'll actually give you driving directions on how to get there. So it's a really, really great tool, and it really allow you to identify all of our wild trout resources, where they're at, and how to get there as well. So that would be my one tip is to go to our website, go to the county guide, and just start exploring, and you'll be amazed what information's out there and where to go.
So the final question, final Jeopardy. We're going to include 3 of you on this answer. And we got a question regarding gobies. It began with gobies in Northwest Pennsylvania and how they may or may not be spreading from Lake LaBeouf into the upper part of French Creek, which is one of our most, if not our most, biologically diverse streams in Pennsylvania. And so any invasive there is a concern. The question also included concerns. What concerns do we have about snakeheads? And what concerns do we have about New Zealand mud snails? So I'd like to take this final question and break it into 3 parts. I would like Brian Ensign to give us some insight on the round gobies in Northwest Pennsylvania. Dave Nyhart to give us some insight on New Zealand mud snails, and particularly in trout streams and how they might get moved around and how we might prevent more movement. And then Jeff Smith on snakeheads, not just in the Susquehanna River, but in Pennsylvania in general. So if you'd like to start, Brian, and touch on round gobies, we'll go through the panelists, and then when Jeff is done, we will close down the Q&A portion of the panel discussion.
Okay. All right, great question. So being in the Northwest area here, we do have a direct interaction with our round goby populations. These would be inland populations outside of obviously Lake Erie. So specifically in LaBeouf Lake, and this is for those of you who don't know where that's at, it's actually in Erie County. LaBeouf Lake is an open system, therefore there is no dam on it. They were first documented in August of 2014 by DEP. And they found all size classes of round gobies in there. LaBeouf Lake flows into LaBeouf Creek, and then it flows into French Creek, as Andy mentioned. So there are some serious concerns about this invasive species and what kind of effects it might have on the native populations in the creek. We've been documenting the species and monitoring its increases and decreases in population. There are several folks that are part of this monitoring process, to include universities such as Allegheny College, as well as some conservation groups, and as well as other state and federal agencies. We actually have a work group right now that discusses, sets up as far as field sampling plans and what we're going to monitor to do that. It's unfortunate that round gobies have been established, and their eradication is something that's most likely not going to happen. But one positive thing we are seeing with them is we are seeing a slight decline in their populations. We've been working with our fish pathologist staff as well too, about VHS is a big concern that we have in our agency, and it's been shown that maybe these are kind of linked up with that a little bit. But we found out that there's some of the testing that we did, they're completely negative with that, which is a good sign. But again, we continue to monitor their populations and continue to look at ways of what we can do to control them. And keep in mind, we do have some sampling set up this year to go back into LaBeouf Lake, working with our Department of Environmental Services, and looking at the status of that lake, and the concerns with within LaBeouf Creek as well too. They have been documented in French Creek, but only at the upper, actually where LaBeouf Creek enters French Creek. So there's some diet studies going on. There's several universities really working on this. And then we'll be providing more information on that as we move ahead.
One quick follow-up, Brian, for listeners who don't have our acronym dictionary at hand. VHS stands for
virohemorrhagic septicemia. So that's what we've documented in Lake Erie, and that there was some literature saying that there might be some possible linkages with them, but we did some testing within LaBeouf Creek through our fish pathologist, and that was negative for that. So that was a big concern of ours.
Thank you. Dave, New Zealand mud snails.
Yeah, so we've certainly been coming across populations of New Zealand mud snails throughout the Commonwealth in various watersheds. Particularly, we've come across it in some of our well-known and most popular trout streams, Spring Creek, Little Lehigh River, Little Lehigh Creek, to name a few. So it can be concerning. Obviously, New Zealand mud snails are competing for some of the same food resources that macroinvertebrates are also competing for. And when you think of trout populations and a healthy trout population, obviously food sources is a big thing. So if New Zealand mud snails are affecting ultimately the food source of trout, we will see some issues moving forward. As of now, we really haven't documented anything. It doesn't mean that we're not going to. So obviously, as biologists, we're continuing to gain additional information. And if we feel that there's a threat, we'll continue to monitor those populations. But noticing where we're finding New Zealand mud snails, one thing comes to mind as far as how they are being transported from one area to another is likely through anglers. When you're finding them in areas of Spring Creek, the Little Lehigh Creek, obviously these are destination fisheries. So chances are, as anglers are going from one stream to another, they're transporting them with them. So I would just absolutely remind anglers, if you're moving from stream to stream every day or a few days in between, please inspect your gear. And we have a lot of information on our website that helps you identify what invasive species you are and what some of the necessary steps to do to help and aid in not moving them throughout the Commonwealth.
Very good. Thanks, Dave. And Jeff, snakeheads.
Yeah, snakeheads are probably our most recent fish invader. And as snakeheads as a species go, probably the worst PR person in the world, because everyone knows about snakeheads and how bad they are. So they've moved in. We're really not entirely sure of their impacts yet. They're so new to the systems that people aren't really certain as to what impact they're causing. But with any of these species, it's, to use the adage, an ounce of prevention is more than a pound of cure. So keeping them out is really the most important aspect of them showing up in our systems. We don't really want them here because we don't know what impact they may have down the road. I'm working primarily on the Susquehanna population, which was just showed up last year. through some fishways. So they've limited that fishway operation for movement of migratory species like American shad as a result of this. So we definitely want to keep these species out before they even show up. So we'll keep an eye on the Susquehanna population, try to keep it at bay, and keep it out of our water bodies as long as we can, because we're really not sure what impact it will have, but it could be huge from as far as we know.
Thanks, Jeff. So anyone who's still with us, thank you for hanging in there. I'm going to dismiss the panel at this point, and I'm going to offer some closing comments to wrap up the day. If you're still with us, we'll be at this for approximately 5 more minutes, and then that will be the end of our first ever fishery summit, and certainly our first ever virtual fishery summit. So I'd like to thank our panel for going at this for an hour now and answering all the questions, and as many as we could get to from the public, and for all your expertise today and always. So thanks, guys, and we'll dismiss you, and then I will offer some closing comments.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. See you on the water.
All right. So I'd like to offer some closing comments. And I think you're going to be seeing some images as I'm doing that. And so we've had a full day of presentations about many popular Pennsylvania sport fish. You've heard a lot of good fishery science, seen some numbers and graphics, and lots of big fish pictures. Our fisheries biologists have told you about our current state records and where those exceptional Pennsylvania specimens rank on a national and even world record scale. The Fish and Boat Commission maintains its Angler Award Program and annual Big Fish Records, which provides insight into the locations, methods, and times of year our biggest fish are caught. If you review the records, there are definitely patterns that you can discover which should improve your chances of making a memorable catch. You can find the Angler Award pages under Pennsylvania Fishes on our www.fishandboat.com website. While on the Pennsylvania Fishes page, you can jump to the best fishing waters and the biologist reports. The best fishing waters are selected by our area fisheries managers based on criteria designed to ensure that anglers are fishing a high quality fishery where you have an above average chance for a good fishing experience. They are annually updated as conditions change. The biologist reports give current insights into recent field sampling and provide a brief report on the sizes and numbers of certain species in waters throughout Pennsylvania. So how do you take the information you've just learned and use it to plan fishing trips in 2021 and beyond? Well, a great place to start is to download the Fish Boat PA app through the App Store or Google Play onto your smartphone or tablet. This will put the power of stocking schedules, rules and regulations, licensed sellers, boat launches, special regulations areas, best fishing waters, fish identifications, and many other useful tools into the palm of your hand. The Near Me feature will get you headed to a local water in no time at all. The Pennsylvania Angler and Boater magazine is published bi-monthly and has great where to go and how to do it articles focused on Pennsylvania fishing. A certain number of articles in each issue are published for free on the fishandboat.com website and are worth checking out. What if you're not sure about how to rig up or what gear to use for a certain species or type of fishing? Well, either via the app, through our webpage, or just by going to YouTube and typing in Fish and Boat Commission, you'll find a host of educational and informative videos about fish, fishing, boating safety, and many other aquatic resource topics that will help you learn additional skills and techniques. We are adding to this library almost weekly and will continue to update the media and topics on a regular basis. And we have an unfolding clinic going on right now on ice fishing. Everything you need to know to get started in ice fishing, be successful, and do it safely is appearing on YouTube in the last day or so. So we encourage you to try something different in 2021 and beyond. While keeping COVID-19 travel guidelines in mind, why not try a trip to a new water where you've never been, or familiar water, but for a species you've not targeted before? Trying new waters, learning about their nuances, and cracking a code, so to speak, is a part of the fun for many anglers. You'll be able to find today's presentations on the Commission's YouTube channel and be able to go back and refer to the information as often as you wish. If you're concerned that you don't have the right tackle for new experiences, rest assured that many of Pennsylvania's most sought-after sport fish, like bass, trout, catfish, and walleyes, can be caught on a 6 to 7 foot medium weight spinning outfit set up for 6 to 12 pound line and lures in 2 to 4 inch lengths. On the fly fishing side, a 5, 6, or 7 weight outfit will handle the majority of trout, panfish, and bass fishing in Pennsylvania. There are countless online articles about the best 5 or 10 flies or lures for bass and trout, and many of the same flies and lures are in everyone's list. Big fish eat little fish, and live bait in the form of minnows from a local bait shop is often hard to beat. Finally, while you're out fishing this year on Pennsylvania's waterways, keep in mind that the quality of fishing is only as good as the habitat, the water quality, fisheries management practices, and regulations that are in place allow it to be. Do your part to respect our waterways and take an active interest in programs and policies that protect, conserve, and enhance Pennsylvania's uncommon natural wealth. Thank you for the privilege of your time today. We hope that you learned some things that will help you catch more fish and help you make great fishing memories in the years ahead. And so I'd like us to take a look at the folks that were involved in this event today. And you can read those names there. There's a plan committee, technical support, our Commissioner, Rick Hoffman, Executive Director, Tim Schaefer, which kicked it off, and all the presenters on the right-hand side, some of which were also members of the panel today. We would not have been able to do this without their good work and their time and ability to provide this information for you. So to close, on behalf of the Board of the Commissioners, the Fisheries Committee Chair, Rick Hoffman, Executive Director, Tim Schaefer, Commission President, Richard Lewis, and all the Fish and Boat Commission staff, I am Andy Shiels, wishing you tight lines and safe days on the water.